2 days before my wedding, my parents cornered me in a church dressing room and handed me an ultimatum. Either I took my grandfather off the head table, or they would walk out of the rehearsal and skip the wedding entirely. My father stood there, adjusting his cuffs with clinical precision, and told me that a retired school janitor with calloused hands sitting next to the bride would embarrass them in front of his corporate colleagues. He believed a blue-collar father was the worst thing that could happen to his reputation. He was wrong. What happened when my father's CEO walked across that reception hall was something my parents never saw coming, and it changed our family history forever. I was 7 years old when my parents, Richard and Linda, moved to Columbus so my dad could climb the corporate ladder at Meridian Freight Systems, a massive logistics company. They left me in Dayton with my grandfather Walter, promising it was just for a year until they settled. That year stretched into my entire childhood. Grandpa's house became my sanctuary, filled with the scents of floor wax and black coffee. He worked as the custodian at my elementary school, and every single night as he locked up, he'd tell me to leave every room better than I found it. It was a philosophy he lived by, whether he was scrubbing paint off art room tables or quietly helping a neighbor. My parents only drove down every few months. Their visits felt less like family time and more like audits. Dad reviewed my report cards like quarterly sales figures, while Mom looked at Grandpa's modest home, with the cold, assessing eye of a real estate agent trying to flip a bad listing. To them, life was a scoreboard where love was bought with high grades, prestigious colleges, and impressive job titles. When I was 22 and proudly announced I had passed the postal exam to secure a stable route in Dayton, my father didn't celebrate. He just went quiet and asked if I was actually happy telling people that for a living. From that day on, he quietly filed me away as a disappointment and moved on. The most disturbing part of their obsession with status was how they treated Grandpa Walter. They didn't argue with him. They simply acted like he didn't exist. He was left off the guest list for company picnics, holiday parties, and even the massive steakhouse dinner Dad threw when he made vice president. When I finally asked my father about it, he coldly told me that some worlds shouldn't mix. It took me 4 more years to understand what he was actually afraid of, and by then, my own wedding invitations were already in the mail, when Ethan, an 11th grade history teacher, who laughs at his own jokes, proposed to me at the end of my mail route. We wanted a simple, honest wedding. We planned a modest reception for 200 guests at a local hall, with Grandpa sitting proudly at the head table. But when we announced the engagement, my parents immediately tried to buy control. Dad slid a $30,000 check across the dinner table, claiming he wanted things done properly, while Mom talked about presentation and staging. Beneath that check was a leather portfolio containing a highly strategic guest list of 26 corporate executives, including Raymond Whitfield, the CEO of Meridian Freight Systems. Dad had spent 20 years positioning himself for an open senior vice president role, and he viewed my wedding as the ultimate corporate networking event. Before I knew it, I was negotiating away my own wedding. I gave up the band I wanted, lost my florist, and let my mother redesign the entire aesthetic. The breaking point arrived with the seating chart. Mom sent a color-coded diagram where the Meridian executives were positioned prime and center. While my grandfather was pushed to table 14, a dark corner behind a massive pillar next to the kitchen door, completely out of sight. When I called my mother to protest, she dismissed my concerns, saying it was cleaner to keep the head table for the hosts. I drove to Grandpa's house in tears, ready to fight on his behalf, but he just wiped his hands on a rag and told me not to burn down my family over a chair. He was 78 years old, and he had never once fought for his own dignity. He simply went about his life, polishing his shoes for his annual, mysterious pension meeting downtown, which he attended once a year in a sleek black town car that came to pick him up. My Aunt Carol later revealed the source of my father's deep-seated shame. When Dad was 12, his schoolmates found out his father was the maintenance man at the local trucking depot. During lunch, a group of popular boys soaked a dirty cleaning rag in a water fountain, dropped it directly onto Dad's lunch tray, and laughed at him. Dad went home, threw the tray at Grandpa, and begged him to get a desk job. Grandpa, burdened with a mortgage and a sick wife, simply replied that work was work. Dad never forgave him, and he spent the next 40 years running away from that mop. The tension peaked during a family meeting at my parents' house. where Dad presented a literal slide deck titled Seating Optics. He pointed to a diagram and explained that the CEO would be sitting 14 feet from the head table, and having a retired school janitor in a cheap suit next to the bride was a story the company would talk about on Monday. He looked me in the eye and said, "People remember the mop, not the man." That was the moment something broke inside me. I realized they hadn't bought a wedding. They had bought an exhibition, and I was just the prop. The next morning, I drove to Columbus and quietly placed the untouched $30,000 check on their kitchen counter alongside a list of cancellations. I stripped away their expensive catering, their corporate photographer, and their high-end florist. We went back to the wedding Ethan and I could actually afford. When word got out on my mail route that I had lost my florist, the elderly ladies I delivered letters to for 7 years opened up their gardens, donating buckets of fresh roses. A retired music teacher volunteered to play the old upright piano, and the ladies from the local food pantry offered to bake the food. It was turning into a beautiful, community-driven event, but my parents were horrified, threatening not to attend a glorified potluck. But then, a heavy cream envelope arrived in my mailbox. The CEO, Raymond Whitfield, had accepted the invitation. Because the big boss was coming, my parents suddenly had no choice but to attend. They couldn't risk the embarrassment of the CEO noticing their empty seats. Dad tried to negotiate one last time, offering to let Grandpa attend the ceremony, but slip away before the reception or sit quietly at the back. I held my ground, keeping my grandfather's hand-lettered place card right at the center of the head table. At the rehearsal, my parents made their final move. They cornered me in the tiny church dressing room, and Mum pulled Grandpa's handwritten place card out of her purse, having stolen it from the venue earlier that afternoon. Right in front of me, she crumpled the card, callously explaining they would have a professional calligrapher redo the seating. At that exact moment, the dressing room door creaked open. Grandpa stood in the doorway, holding a napkin with 3 lemon bars he had brought for us to share. He had heard every single word. I watched his spine straighten, but he didn't raise his voice. He simply set the treats down, looked at my parents with a quiet, devastating calm, and told me he'd see me on Saturday. The wedding day was gorgeous, filled with the warmth of true friends, the scent of backyard roses, and the sound of laughter. Grandpa sat proudly at the head table in his neatly pressed suit, looking more distinguished than anyone else in the room. My parents sat at their table, stiff and tense, barely acknowledging anyone, terrified of what would happen when the corporate executives arrived. Midway through the reception, the double doors opened and Raymond Whitfield walked in. My father immediately stood up, smoothing his jacket and preparing his best corporate smile to greet his boss. But Whitfield didn't even look at my father. He bypassed the entire executive table, walked straight past my stuttering dad, and headed directly toward the head table, with a bright, genuine smile. The CEO reached out and warmly shook my grandfather's hand. He called him Walter and asked why he hadn't mentioned his brilliant granddaughter was getting married. The entire room fell dead silent. My father stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as Whitfield pulled up a chair and began chatting with Grandpa like an old friend. It turned out that decades ago, before Harlan Trucking merged to become the corporate giant Meridian Freight, it was facing absolute bankruptcy. The humble maintenance man, Walter Brooks, had quietly stepped in. He had used his life savings and a brilliant, self-designed logistics routing system, the blueprint I had seen in the old photo, to save the company from collapse. In exchange, he negotiated a massive share of the company, but refused a corporate desk, choosing instead to keep working with his hands. The mysterious annual town car trips were not pension meetings. They were private, closed-door shareholder briefings, where Grandpa Walter held some of the most significant voting power in the entire corporation. Whitfield looked over at my stunned father and remarked that Walter was the silent foundation of everything Meridian had built. He then casually mentioned that the board had been discussing the open senior vice president position, and that Walter had actually vetoed Richard's promotion. Grandpa had quietly told the board that while Richard was skilled with numbers, he still hadn't learned how to value the people who kept the building standing. My parents sat in absolute silence as the reality of their decades-long mistake washed over them. The very man they had tried to hide, The father they treated as an embarrassment was the entire reason they had their comfortable lives and corporate titles. The mop they were so ashamed of had built the cathedral they worshipped. When the music started playing, Grandpa Walter stood up, smoothed his suit jacket, and asked me for a dance. As we moved across the floor of the beautiful, crowded room, he looked around at the happy faces, the backyard flowers, and the homemade food. He leaned in and whispered that we had left the room much better than we found it. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what he meant.